Test, test. Wasn't this? Yeah. Test, test. 1, 2. Mic check.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all, especially South Korean Ambassador Han, to today's Trade Subcommittee hearing on the U.S.-South Korea Trade Agreement. Today's hearing is the third in our series of hearings on each of the pending trade agreements, Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. As I've said at each of the previous hearings, I firmly believe that we should consider all of the three agreements by July 1st. I welcome the administration's announcement yesterday that it has reached agreement with Colombia. I look forward to quick movement on the action plan and working with the administration to ensure submission of all three agreements for congressional consideration by July 1st. All three pending trade agreements are good agreements. The time to move forward with all three is now. I know that many Democrats share our sense of urgency. With respect to the Korea-U.S. trade agreement, we all know that the European Union-South Korea trade agreement is expected to enter into force by July 1st. Implementation of agreements by other countries and continued inaction on our agreement will result in further missed opportunities to create American jobs. In fact, it will result in a decline in existing American jobs. We either move forward or we fall backward. The choice is ours. Staying still is just not an option. The economic benefits of the pending trade agreements are overwhelming. The ITC International Trade Commission estimates that the three pending trade agreements together would increase U.S. exports by at least $13 billion and add $10 billion to our GDP. And President Obama stated that such an increase in U.S. exports could support 250,000 jobs. These benefits are enjoyed broadly. For example, the American Farm Bureau estimates that the U.S. farm exports to South Korea could increase by more than $1.8 billion each year. Moreover, 90% of all American companies exporting South Korea are small and medium-sized enterprises. Implementation of the agreement will lead to an additional $2.8 billion in exports for small and medium-sized American companies. This agreement, like the Colombian Panama deals, would level the playing field for U.S. exporters. The average South Korea tariff for U.S. exporters is more than 4 times the average tariff that South Korean products face in the U.S. market. The agreement would address this imbalance. The state-of-the-art Korea agreement, like Colombia and Panama, will address key non-tariff and regulatory barriers, such as sanitary and phytosanitary barriers, requiring strong protection of intellectual property rights, requiring greater regulatory transparency, and encouraging greater regulatory harmonization and the use of international standards. We cannot also overlook the fact that South Korea is a key ally in a critical region of the world. The U.S.-South Korea trade agreement is important not only for its economic benefits, but also for our national security. Just today, I received a letter signed by a number of former senior officials in trade and foreign policy highlighting the key geostrategic role that Korea plays and urging Congress to pass all three agreements as quickly as possible. Without objection, I'd like to enter that letter into the record. Now that I've highlighted some of the benefits of the U.S.-Korea agreement, I'd like to set the record straight on a few points. First, Republicans are very excited about moving forward on the Korean agreement, just as we're excited to move forward with the Panama and Colombia agreements. Our goal is simply to speed up the Latin America agreements to catch up with the Korean agreement. There's a sense of urgency for all of them as these trading partners are moving ahead without us to conclude agreements with our competitors that don't include us. Second, our view is that all three agreements must be considered is simply not a Republican view. Key Democrats, such as the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, explicitly agree with this view. Strong bipartisan support for all three was also very clear from the strong statements of the support that were issued yesterday in response to the administration's welcome announcement about Colombia. Third, despite what some are saying, we've already started the bipartisan technical drafting work on the Korea agreement with this administration. On March 7th, Chairman Dave Camp agreed to Ambassador Kirk's written request to begin technical discussions on the draft implementing bill, noting that discussions between congressional and administration staffs were scheduled for later that day. Those technical discussions are ongoing. We are awaiting responses to questions that staff on both sides of the aisle have raised with USTR. We are working constructively together to move forward in a timely manner to ensure that the draft implementing bill is complete and thorough. At the same time, I would urge the administration to work with us on this technical work for the Colombian Panama agreements too. Both Ambassador Kirk and Ambassador Shapiro have made clear that the resolution of any outstanding issues will not require changes to the text of the agreement. believe we should start this technical work immediately to ensure that the drafting is complete and thorough and the draft implementing bills are ready to go. We can't waste any more time. I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses today and thank them for being with us. I look forward to hearing the testimony of both panels. At this time, I would yield to Ranking Member McDermott for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Brady, for scheduling this hearing. Finally, we're discussing a free trade agreement that's ready for congressional consideration right now. An FTA that will generate more than $10 billion in increasing U.S. exports, $11 billion in increased GDP, and as many as 277,000 new American jobs. The Korean FTA brings economic benefits to each and every state in this union. In Texas, where Chairman Brady and Mr. Doggett live, estimates indicate that the FTA will increase 27,000 new jobs in a range of sectors from agriculture to transportation. In Washington, where Mr. Reichert and I reside, we catch a lot of fish and produce a lot of agriculture and timber. The Korean FTA is expected to create 1,500 new jobs in those sectors alone. In California, where Mr. Davis and Mr. Herger live and where unemployment is 12.3%, it's estimated that the FTA will create 26,000 new jobs. In Florida, Mr. Buchanan's state, the state's citrus growers and processors support the FTA, which would phase out steep tariffs on U.S. orange juice. And those additional exports would go through the port in Manatee he talks about in this committee. In Illinois, where Mr. Schock lives, is the second largest soybean producer in the country, and under the FTA, soybean production will increase by $565 million to $850 million. And we know that Congresswoman Jenkins is very concerned about beef. Nebraska, where Mr. Smith's district is located, is another major producer. Well, under the Korean FTA, beef exports are expected to increase by $633 million. It is clear that the FTA from Korea would produce a real economic boost, spurring economic growth all over the country. The administration has been ready to move on the FTA for more than a month. And yet the Republican majority refuses to move, putting all of the FTA potential economic gains in California, Illinois, Florida, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, and all over the United States on hold. The EU-South Korea FTA goes into effect on July 1. Each day that the Congress delays passage of the U.S.-Korea FTA puts U.S. businesses and workers at a greater disadvantage compared to their European counterparts. And the Republicans know this. Back in 2009, they argued that we should pass the flawed version of the FTA, even though the auto provisions were fixed, to make sure that we didn't fall behind the EU. The Republicans' own estimates suggest that U.S. workers and businesses would lose $1.1 billion in exports to Korea once the EU-Korea trade agreement is fully implemented. Well, it's around the corner, my friends. So what's the holdup? Well, it can't be Colombia anymore. The president announced yesterday exactly what the Republicans have been demanding. If, despite the announcement, the Republicans continue to dither on Korea, then their motivation is just plain ugly politics. And it's time to end that. There's too much on the line. So here's what I suggest. USTR Ambassador Ron Kirk should send the draft of implementing legislation to Congress immediately and request the Ways and Means Committee to do a swift review and a mock markup. After a reasonable period of consultation, let's say 3 weeks, the administration should then formally submit the FTA implementing legislation so that it can be introduced and fast-track procedures, including the specific timelines for consideration, initiated. There is no reason that both the House and Senate cannot pass this meaningful agreement by Memorial Day. Before it's too late for American families and business, it's time to get moving. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member McDermott. Today we have two panels of witnesses. On our first panel is our witness from the administration, Ambassador Demetrius Marantis, Deputy U.S. Trade Representative from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Ambassador, welcome. We look forward to your testimony. I'd ask you to keep your testimony 5 minutes, and your written statement will be made part of the record. I do want to take a moment to applaud the President, Ambassador Kirk, and the USTR negotiating team for improving what was a very solid agreement with Korea. but working with then Chairman Levin, Chairman Camp, and others in Congress in close consultation improved the Korean agreement. That was a significant achievement, and I very much appreciate your work on that. At this point, I would recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Brady, Ranking Member McDermott, and members of the KIC Committee. It's a really exciting time to be involved in international trade right now, and it's a real honor for me to be here to testify before you on the U.S.-Korea trade agreement. Let me also welcome Ambassador Han, who's here. He's been my partner in crime for the past couple years as we've been trying to navigate the difficulties that we together faced. Congress has the singular opportunity to pass the most economically significant trade agreement in nearly 2 decades. The U.S.-Korea trade agreement will strengthen our trade and investment ties to Korea's $1 trillion economy. It will bind a key ally closer to us, anchor our economy to the dynamic Asia-Pacific region, and help us keep our edge over international competition. Most importantly, this agreement will create substantial export opportunities, establish strong enforcement provisions, and support tens of thousands of new export-oriented jobs. The Korea agreement is just the first example of how this administration has worked to make our trade agreements better. The President has underscored his intention to present pending trade agreements to Congress once we have adequately addressed key outstanding concerns. In December, we did so with Korea. This week, Panama has taken steps to complete work on outstanding tax and labor issues. And later today, the President will announce an agreement with Colombia on an action plan to address outstanding labor issues. Congress must now work on passing a comprehensive trade policy, one that includes the pending trade agreements, trade adjustment assistance, our preference programs, and permanent normal trade relations with Russia. The U.S.-Korea trade agreement is ready to move today. The President and many of you had serious concerns about the deal signed in 2007. We heard you and we took action. After extensive consultations with members of this committee and a wide range of stakeholders, the U.S. and Korea agreed last December to make Korea's auto market more fair, open, and transparent. We leveled the playing field by addressing key non-tariff barriers in Korea's auto safety and environmental regulations. We encouraged green technologies by immediately cutting in half Korea's tariffs on electric cars and eliminating these tariffs within 5 years. We negotiated a tariff structure that will give American auto companies and their workers a chance to build more business in Korea before U.S. tariffs come down. And we negotiated a new special motor vehicle safeguard. These commitments allow us to unlock the economic potential of the 2007 agreement. Immediately upon entry into force, this agreement eliminates tariffs on 2/3 of U.S. agricultural exports to Korea. Within 5 years of entry into force, it removes tariffs on over 95% of consumer goods exports, and it provides significant market access to Korea's $580 billion services market. Underpinning these new export opportunities are the Korea Agreement's state-of-the-art provisions to protect and enforce intellectual property rights, reduce red tape, and eliminate regulatory barriers to U.S. exports. This agreement contains the highest standards for protecting labor rights, promoting the environment, and ensuring that key domestic labor and environmental laws are enforced. Taken together, these additional export opportunities mean more jobs for Americans. The tariff reductions on goods alone will lead to significant increases in U.S. exports to Korea that will support over 70,000 U.S. jobs. More services exports to Korea will support tens of thousands additional jobs, and fewer non-tariff barriers and stronger rules will support even more. We remain committed to further opening beef markets across Asia, including Korea, consistent with international science. In the meantime, the U.S.-Korea agreement, when implemented, will progressively reduce Korea's 40% beef tariff and enable U.S. beef producers to build upon the exponential growth of exports to Korea. Working with you, this administration addressed outstanding concerns with this agreement. Working with you, we made significant improvements that will have real benefits to our auto industry, its workers, and our economy. and working with you, we can now move forward. Now is the time to act on this agreement so American families can realize the many benefits of the U.S. trade agreement. Working together, let's move this agreement without further delay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ambassador, thank you very much. You've set out in your testimony a very strong case for this agreement for a number of reasons. I'd like to talk about two concerns that I've heard raised by critics I'd like your help in addressing. First, some folks are concerned about how the agreement might affect the textile industry. I know this agreement includes state-of-the-art provisions to address major concerns such as transshipment, a surge in imports, and enforcement. It also includes a strict rule of origin. So the first question is, does this agreement benefit textile and apparel manufacturers in the U.S., and how would the provisions I mentioned address concerns raised by them? And when you finish that, I'd like to ask you about the Kaesong industrial area and some of the provisions in the bill as well.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. 75% of U.S. textile and apparel exports to Korea would receive duty-free treatment immediately upon implementation of the agreement. That's really important because Korea is becoming a larger destination for U.S. textile and apparel exports. Right now, Korea is our 10th largest market. Last year alone, our textile and apparel exports to Korea increased by 45%. So getting this agreement in force now is very important, particularly when you think about the EU and its textile exports and the competition that we'd face in that market. But as you mentioned, Chairman Brady, textiles is a sensitive sector in the U.S., and there are very important provisions in this agreement that address that. First, we have delayed staging of certain sensitive products in terms of when the U.S. will reduce its tariffs. In some cases, that staging extends as long as 10 years. Second, as you mentioned, we have a very important rule of origin that the industry supports strongly, which is the yarn forward rule, which basically says products can't receive preferential treatment unless the yarn and the fabric is produced in either South Korea or the United States. Third, we have a special textile safeguard in the agreement that allows us to address instances when increased imports may cause serious damage to the industry producing like or directly competitive products. And finally, as you mentioned, the agreement contains very strong provisions on transshipment. It allows for increased information sharing between U.S. and Korea customs authorities. It allows U.S. customs authorities to conduct verification activities in Korea. And if there's ever a problem, CBP, our customs authority, has the authority to take penalty actions, including denial of entry of goods. And that just builds upon the provisions that CBP already does in terms of post-import verifications and other mechanisms it uses to prevent transshipment.
Thank you. Very helpful. Second, some of us have expressed concerns that products produced in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which is located in North Korea but operated jointly by North-South Korean workers, they're concerned they'd be treated as products originating from South Korea under the agreement. I understand that the agreement specifically requires legislative action, in other words, an act of Congress, before products from Kaesong are permitted to enter the United States. Please describe what the effect of this requirement is, and please describe whether products from Kaesong could receive benefits under the agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of confusion on this issue, and let me be very clear. Goods produced in Kaesong do not receive any benefits under the U.S.-Korea trade agreement. Any change to how Kaesong is treated under the agreement would require Congress to pass and the President to sign legislation. So there is nothing in this agreement that provides any benefits to Kaesong. In fact, the word Kaesong doesn't even appear in the agreement.
And if there were to be any change, it actually literally an act of Congress signed by a president before.
Yes, any recommendations that there's a committee that's established under the agreement for outward processing zones that can make recommendations. If we choose to act on those recommendations, the only way to do so is to come here and seek legislative authority from Congress. So Congress has the final word. It would have to pass a law, and the President would have to sign that law into force.
Thank you for putting that confusion to rest. Appreciate it. Ranking Member McDermott.
Thank you. I want to begin by apology. I moved Mr. Davis from Kentucky to California. That is that is a severe insult to him, and I apologize publicly. I met Mr. Nunes.
Well, I thank the gentleman for pointing that out. I reminded folks that I live in the United States, not in California, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
I would like to ask you a question, because I think there's a whole lot of misunderstanding about Kaesong. And I've been there and on one of my trips to Korea. And I would like you to explain to the committee what Kaesong is really all about, why the South Koreans have created this, there's a lot of mythology floating around. It'd be nice to have somebody give some facts about why they created it, what they're doing with it, what the intention is, and so forth.
Sure, I'd be happy to. As you mentioned, Mr. McDermott, there is a special industrial zone over the border in North Korea called Kaesong, which South Korea launched in 2003 as an effort to encourage reforms in North Korea. And it is an industrial complex that produces a wide variety of goods. Ties between North and South Korea have deteriorated, as we all know, and as a result of that, South Korea has banned new investment in Kaesong since May 2010.
And the industries were from South Korea, and the workers were?
North Korean workers. Who
Who then went back into the community with knowledge about how the free enterprise system might work.
Correct. I mean, the idea behind Kaesong, when it was originally launched, was to help to provide, new exposure for North Korean workers as to, business practices in South Korea, and as part of an effort to encourage reforms in North Korea.
And also in anticipation that at some point there may be a reunification between North and South Korea, and having workers understand what they're coming in. It's not like Germany, where it was three people three democratic Germans for one communist German. In this case, it's a huge number of people coming into the economy, and they want to try to transition, or at least begin the process of transitioning. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, South Korea is more than a key trading partner. It's also a key geostrategic ally in Asia. Currently, there are more than 28,000 American troops stationed in the country, and our militaries regularly conduct joint exercises. Our geostrategic relationship is important not only to counteract the threat from North Korea, but also dealing with China's military ambitions and security in general in the Pacific Rim. Could you discuss the broader geostrategic significance of this agreement?
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Yes, I mean, Korea, as you mentioned, is a critical strategic ally of the United States, and what we're doing as part of the free trade agreement is helping to bolster the economic pillar of the U.S. strategic relationship. A strong, prosperous South Korea is very much in the strategic interest of the United States, which is why negotiation, conclusion, and ratification and entry into force of this agreement is a win-win for both of us. It's good for both the South Korean economy and the U.S. economy, and as a result, it's a good tool to help bolster a very important ally.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, given what you've just said, I was wondering if you could also address how this is any different from the geostrategic considerations and the importance of our partnership with Colombia, particularly given the fight against narco-trafficking, the influence of Hugo Chavez in the region.
Sure. I personally don't work on Latin America and Colombia issues, so I don't have a lot to say. But in a very similar way, Mr. Davis, Colombia is an important strategic ally in the region, and working on the free trade agreement is a way to help again strengthen Colombia's economy in a volatile region.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first of all want to thank you, Ambassador, and Ambassador Kirk and the entire USTR team, and also special recognition to Ambassador Hahn, who we've been working closely with too, and excited about the upcoming vote to come soon. I want to mention how much of an honor and a pleasure it's been to work with the Export Initiative group and their commitment to doubling exports. And I think finally recognizing the importance of passing trade agreements to accomplish that goal. As I've said many times in our trade hearings from 1995 through 2007, I think is the last time we doubled our exports, and we passed 9 trade agreements. So I think everyone's recognizing the value there, the possible loss of jobs if we don't pass these agreements. So I really want to focus on the jobs issue, because sometimes there is some misinformation that gets out there, and some opponents, I think, may skew the numbers just a little bit. But just with the Korean agreement, the first estimate was 70,000 jobs that could be created, as you mentioned in your testimony. Senator Wyden has completed a study that estimates the job gain would be almost 280,000, which includes our services industry, which, as you know, is about 80% of our economy now. So what's your view on some of the organizations that say we're going to lose 160,000 jobs versus the 70,000, the 280,000, the loss of market share as the EU and Canada and China and others come? We want to sell American. I mean, that's the goal, right? Sell American across the world. So what do you say to those people who are saying that we're going to lose jobs with these agreements?
Thank you, Mr. Reichert. I mean, to start off, the study that suggests that there's going to be 160,000 job losses is just plain wrong. That study doesn't even use the Korea agreement as a model as it's examining the Korea agreement. It extrapolates from other sources to draw conclusions which we believe are not accurate. That study also relies on what we think is not appropriate methodology in terms of linking an increase in trade deficits to job losses. First of all, the ITC has been very clear that the trade deficit, it predicts that our trade deficit, our $4 billion trade deficit that we currently have with Korea, will be reduced by the agreement by anywhere between $3.3 and $4 billion. And assuming a link between trade deficits and job losses that isn't really supported by historical evidence. During the Great Depression, a time where we had very high employment, we ran trade surpluses. In the 90s, when we were operating at very close to full employment, we ran large trade deficits. But to your point, sir, is this agreement is all about jobs. And the export opportunities, the 10 to 12 billion in annual exports that this agreement's going to create in goods trade alone will produce, a conservative estimate on our part, 70,000 jobs. And that's just goods trade. That's not when you look at services trade and other areas.
Well, I appreciate your recognition of that falsehood on the loss of jobs. And one of the things I think that the USTR and the Export Council is looking at is educating people across the country as to the benefits of trade, because even, believe it or not, the longshoremen, whose paycheck is 100% dependent upon trade, are some are against trade. So the last question I want to ask real quick, the environment's very important to all of us, and especially for those of us in Washington State, it's very important to us. The language in the Colombian Agreement, Panama Agreement, and the Korean Agreement, aren't they exactly the same as it relates to the environment?
Yes, sir. We have the most high standard environmental provisions in Korea, Colombia, Panama, as well as in the Peru Agreement. And I'm happy to go into as much agonizing detail as you want, but we are very proud of the text of the environmental agreement.
Korea's made great progress there, am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neal's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, it's always easy to talk about the benefits or the shortcomings of trade in the generic. It's more difficult, as you know, in the specific. But I do think one of the compelling parts of the argument, obviously, is what our competitors are doing to establish free trade agreements across the globe. And would you comment perhaps on what would happen if this were to fall by the wayside, given what European Union is now doing in seeking greater opportunities for growth through these FTAs?
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Yeah, it would be a big problem. I mean, the EU trade agreement enters into force on July 1st. The longer that agreement is in force, with the Korea agreement not being in force, the longer EU exporters have a competitive edge over our exporters in that market. And the EU is very competitive with us in all sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, and services. And it's very hard to regain market share once you lose it or once another competitor actually gets a leg up. What's very disturbing as well are our statistics. Our market share in Korea has eroded over the past 10 years. In 2003, we were the largest, had the largest import share in Korea at 21%. Now we're at 9%. We're behind Japan and China, and the EU is very quickly catching up. And if their agreement goes into effect and ours doesn't, we will likely be eclipsed by the EU. So now it's very important that we get this passed, entered into force, so that our exporters can take advantage of the huge competitive opportunities that the agreement provides.
How does this help gain a stronger foothold for the United States in Asian markets?
Again, it's a question of, I think, reversing a trend of erosion that we've seen not just in Korea but throughout the Asia-Pacific region. This agreement is critical to that. The negotiations we're doing in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 9-country regional trade agreement that we're doing in the Asia-Pacific is critical to that goal. We need to be in the game very seriously in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region. It's the most dynamic part of the world, and it's the part of the world where we stand to gain competitive export opportunities and the jobs that are supported by those export opportunities.
And lastly, I know that your portfolio does not include South America, but might you speak to the issue of what China is attempting to do in much of South America now, particularly in Brazil and other countries?
Sure. Again, we face, in Latin America, as we do in other parts of the world, the risk that China and other economies are going to take advantage of opportunities that should be ours. We've seen an erosion in market share in the Asia Pacific as an example, and the potential for that is very real in Latin America as well. So we need to seize, the opportunities that are in front of us, get our manufacturers, our service providers, and our farmers and ranchers into those markets so they can sell their made in America and grown in America products.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Herger is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank you for representing a state and an area that's very dependent, California, heavy agriculture, an area that I represent. We're very grateful for the work that you're doing, and I'd like to follow up with my friend from Massachusetts question, if I could. Since our 3 pending trade agreements were signed almost 4 years ago, our trading partners have rushed ahead of us to negotiate bilateral and regional agreements that benefit their exporters and workers to the detriment of ours. The most obvious effect relates to tariff advantages that our competitors enjoy over us, which we have seen play out in Colombia, causing significant harm to our agricultural exports. But there are other effects as well. For example, the European Union has trade agreements that generally require its trading partners to adopt protections for geographic indications of origin, such as various cheese from the EU and member states. This could prevent U.S. companies from producing competing goods outside such EU regions from using those same geographical terms when marketing or selling their products in EU trading partner countries. This is a particular problem in the South Korean market. Mr. Ambassador, could you please discuss what the administration is doing to address this geographic indications market access barrier that will be imposed on us by the EU-South Korea trade agreement, and more broadly the effect on our efforts to export certain products to these markets?
Thanks, Mr. Herger. I had the pleasure of visiting Sacramento a couple months ago and did a great roundtable that your staff put together with agriculture producers in your district on Korea and on the TPP agreement. So thank you again for that.
Thank you for coming.
No, it was great. The dairy industry is a great example of why this agreement is terrific. You know, the dairy exporters will benefit from reduced tariffs and expanded TRQs. They are concerned, as are we, about the geographic indication issue that you raised. You know, as you mentioned, in the Korea-EU agreement, Korea has agreed to protect certain terms as geographic indication, terms that, you know, are used in common, common parlance, and terms that our dairy exporters either use now in Korea or we're planning to use in Korea. It's an issue when the EU-Korea agreement concluded. We've raised, you know, serious concerns with Korea on that issue, and we continue to do so.
Thank you. The American Farm Bureau estimates that agricultural exports to South Korea could increase by $1.8 billion per year if the agreement were implemented. South Korea is already the 5th largest export market of U.S. agricultural products. Immediately upon implementation, almost 2/3 of the U.S. farm products exports would become duty-free. The agreement would also address non-tariff regulatory barriers to agricultural trade by creating a specific committee to address sanitary and phytosanitary matters, which would encourage greater regulatory harmonization and the use of international standards and guidelines. Mr. Ambassador, could you please discuss how this agreement, like the Colombian and Panama agreements, address specific barriers to U.S. agricultural exports and which sectors might stand to benefit the most?
Yes, sir, with pleasure. You know, as with many provisions in this agreement, what's so important in the agriculture sector is that the agreement levels the playing field. Right now, we face average tariffs in Korea in the agriculture sector of nearly 54%, whereas our average tariff in the ag sector is 9%. So this agreement going into force levels the playing field for our farmers and ranchers, and does so in a way that provides incredible export opportunities, you know, throughout the sector. Beef, you know, almonds, pistachios, cherries, asparagus, pork, you name it. It's great for our ag sector. But it's not just about tariff barriers. As you mentioned, it's also about non-tariff measures. As you mentioned, there is a committee to address sanitary and phytosanitary measures. But another key non-tariff measure that this agreement will work on is in the area of transparency. And it's oftentimes very difficult for small businesses, for small farmers and small ranchers to really have a good sense of what the regulatory environment is in a country, in a trading partner, and that's often a deterrent to actually export there. This agreement has unprecedented provisions on transparency that will help us really get at non-tariff measures that have in the past impeded our exports.
Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. Let me just, I was looking at a letter that, I guess, from former Secretary of State's Defense, Commerce, as well as USTA, that was placed in the file earlier by Mr. Brady, our chairman, and they were pointing out a couple of things. One, they said that moving ahead would help us have a leadership position in trade in Asia, but also be a positive effect that would go beyond the Korean Peninsula. And what they were referring to, they said a passage of this could also relieve some of the growing concerns that we have about China's growing influence in the region. And I think they're absolutely right. Could you give us your thoughts and ideas from that standpoint?
Yes. What a great letter, by the way, you know, supported by a whole array of various former officials in different communities. The issue that you raise with respect to China really deals with the importance of our being in the game in the Asia-Pacific region and ensuring that we maintain a competitive edge over our competitors. And that's exactly what this agreement does. By leveling the playing field in the manufacturing, agriculture, and services sector, it allows us to participate more in the Korean market and to reverse the erosion of market share that we've seen in Korea, where China has eclipsed us and where Japan has eclipsed us as you know, top importers. So this is part and parcel of an overall strategy to increase U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific region to the benefit of all of us.
My second point is, as I was looking at the U.S. Chamber, they said that the United States, if we didn't, not just this, but the others, we could lose up to 380,000 jobs and 40 billion export sales. And I think they were looking at all three of the trade agreements. But what is a state like that I represent, Florida, one of the positive things in Florida, we have 14 ports. 14 ports is exports, and I think we're up 15–20%, and that continues to grow. And people are very concerned about these agreements not getting done quickly because it's going on. But what's the net effect in terms of jobs, or from the administration standpoint, with this new agreement being put in place, the Korean agreement?
And this agreement, as you mentioned, it's all about jobs. It's all about creating new export opportunities and those jobs that are supported by those export opportunities. In Florida, we're going to see tremendous benefits in the agriculture sector, fruits, vegetables. We're going to see key benefits in the logistics sector, in the transportation sector. We're going to see key benefits in the area of machinery, electrical equipment, chemicals, all exports that are important to Florida's economy. So for Florida, as for other states in the United States, this agreement is going to be a huge export boon, and as a result, it's going to be a huge job boon.
But do you have actually any numbers that you've put together in terms of the country, the impact it'll have overall, new jobs or new job opportunities as a result of getting this agreement done?
Yes, sir. We have specific numbers for Florida. I don't have them in my head, but we'll get them to you right after the
I'm
hearing.
looking for the U.S. Do you have a number off
Yes.
for the U.S.?
For the U.S., for goods alone, a conservative estimate is it will create 70,000 new jobs. It's harder to have a specific number on services just because the economic data is more difficult to analyze. But we estimate that the access to Korea's $580 billion services market and the new export opportunities that this agreement will create will produce an additional tens of thousands of jobs in the services sector. And then there are other job gains to be had by reduction of regulatory barriers and other non-tariff barriers. So there's a significant jobs.
So Korea alone, we're looking at 100,000 plus jobs that this agreement will mean to America.
Yes, sir, and again, we're being conservative. Senator Wyden worked with the ITC on a study. The ITC did technical assistance for Senator Wyden, and that study estimates a 230,000 job benefit from the agreement. We're being a little bit more conservative, but our number is a minimum.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett?
Well, thank you very much. Just on the ITC issue that you were just mentioning, so has the ITC done a new estimate in contrast with its 2007 estimate concerning job growth that can be expected under this agreement?
No, sir. The ITC...
Are you requesting them to do so?
We're not, largely because many of the trade statistics are basically the same that they were in 2007.
But you don't accept their conclusion that it would have a negligible effect on jobs?
Oh, well, no, we have taken their conclusion that it will grow our exports by $10 to $12 billion to have the figure that the agreement will produce at a minimum 70,000 jobs.
Well, I understand, having written this, you believe it will create many jobs. I'm just a little confused about what part of the ITC you are accepting and what you're not. They concluded before you made these changes in the agreement that it would have negligible effect on jobs and that it would actually cause a U.S. goods trade deficit. You don't agree with either of those conclusions, do you?
Sir, I believe that the ITC report said that on our bilateral trade deficit, which is a $4.4 billion trade deficit now, would be reduced by $3.3 to $4 billion, which is consistent with our analysis.
You don't expect to ask the ITC for any reevaluation or updating of their data?
We don't.
Okay. When do you think we will get the Korea trade agreement?
We're ready, as Ambassador Kirk has mentioned. I actually have a draft copy of the implementing bill with me. We are ready to engage. We've started engaging in technical discussions. We're ready to engage in technical discussions on the actual text.
Is it your testimony that without the changes that were secured, that you have testified about with some pride today that it would have been a mistake for Congress to ratify the Korean trade agreement as originally offered?
I think the changes that we made have enabled us to be able to present this to you and unlock the potential of the 2007 agreement.
So you think without them it would have been a mistake to ratify it?
I think we've made a very good agreement better.
So you were for it before you made the changes?
There were key outstanding concerns that many members of this committee had, and in order for us to be able to go forward, we worked very closely with members of this committee and stakeholders throughout the country to address those concerns.
At any time during those negotiations of the agreement, did USTR seek any changes in the investor provisions?
No, we did not.
The investor provisions are therefore exactly as they were negotiated by the Bush administration.
They are very strong and solid investor provisions.
I understand you think they're good, and that's why you didn't change them, but they are exactly verbatim what the Bush administration negotiated.
Yes.
With reference to the comments that President Obama made back during the campaign about seeking to ensure that those provisions weren't used to undermine public safety or public interest in forums outside U.S. courts, there are no changes that have been made as a result of those policy statements. It's still possible for U.S. health and safety and environmental laws to be challenged in arbitration panels, is it not?
Sir, when this administration came into office, we did an exhaustive review of this agreement, including the investment provisions, and based on that review, we are confident that we can,
I understand you've testified you're satisfied with it. You made no changes in it from the Bush era, but it is possible to challenge U.S. health and safety laws by a foreign investor who thinks that it constitutes a taking, not in our courts, but in a arbitration panel. Isn't that correct? It may not prevail, but it's possible for them to do that.
It's possible. We've been subject to very few challenges in the past, and we've never lost.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you for being here. I so appreciate your energy and enthusiasm this morning. Mr. Ambassador, it's clear that the U.S. agriculture producers and exporters will lose valuable markets if these trade agreements are not passed, certainly hurting farmers, ranchers, and other workers in the agriculture sector. But I think it's also important to focus on all of the businesses that support our agriculture sector, ranging from the companies that provide machinery, fertilizer, seed, and other supplies to farmers and ranchers, as well as small local companies that build the farmer's silo and cut his or her hair. How do you see these agreements affecting all of these businesses and really the entire community in rural America?
That's a great question. I mean, this issue, we are, by creating the export opportunities that we do in this agreement, whether it's in the ag sector or the manufacturing sector, we're creating demand for the finished product. And by creating demand for the finished product, we're creating demand for the downstream product, the small and medium-sized enterprises that supply, large airplanes that we sell to Korea, or the suppliers, like you were saying, the feed suppliers that will supply our farmers and ranchers. So by creating new export opportunities for the finished product, we're creating new opportunities for suppliers and the jobs that those suppliers create.
Great, thank you. Along that same line, it's abundantly clear that the three pending agreements will increase exports of U.S. ag products, greatly helping our farmers and ranchers. However, I understand that these agreements will also open up markets for processed food products and other goods that incorporate the bounty of America's farmers and ranchers and reflect the real value added in the United States. Could you just please comment on how passing these agreements will help these important businesses and their workers, and how passing the three pending agreements would help meet the goal of the President's National Export Initiative to double U.S. exports?
No, and that's a very important point as well. This agreement benefits our raw agriculture exporters as well as exporters of processed products as well. And the key thing it does is that it levels the playing field so that we have more opportunities to sell to Korea's $1 trillion market across the board. You know, in your state, you know, wheat, soybeans, beef, feed corn, those are all products that are going to benefit tremendously from this agreement and will allow us to really boost our relationship and our exports to Korea's gigantic market. We're really excited about the opportunities that this presents in all of your states and in all of your districts. And to the extent to which anyone, you know, wants any really specific information on how this will benefit your district, your state, you know, sort of down to, you know, the most specific level, we're very happy to provide that.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crowley is recognized.
Ambassador, welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McDermott, as well. Let me also thank Chairman Camp and Ranking Member Levin for their work on the Korean Free Trade Agreement and bring us to where we are today. Ambassador, you say you have the draft with you, or a draft with you. Has that been issued to the subcommittee?
Not yet. We have been dotting our I's and crossing our T's, and we've done that, and we've got a
Hasn't been given
text
to
here.
the full committee either, then, if the subcommittee hasn't gotten it.
Correct.
Right? What's the intention in terms of, you brought it with you today, are we going to, is it going to be shared with the committee today?
We're ready to do so whenever
Has the
the
committee
committee's
asked
ready.
for it? Has the chairman asked for it, or has the chairman of the committee asked for it yet, or the leadership of the House asked for it yet?
There have been a number of questions that we've been going back and forth on in terms of how certain provisions will work with both staffs, and I think we've answered those questions in the text, and we're ready to share it. You know.
Has anyone asked for it yet?
Not yet.
No one from the House of Representatives has asked for the draft.
Not yet. We've been continuing our work on it, and we're proud to have it here with us today.
I appreciate that. I just would note that no one has asked for it at this point, and it's still out there. So thank you for that. In terms of, I come from New York City, so if you could just give me a sense of the financial services, and you talk broadly about services, but if you could specifically talk about the opportunities that this agreement will present for that specific sector, financial services in Korea. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this agreement provides new market access opportunities in the financial service sector in eliminating many restrictions to supplying those services in Korea that existed, whether those restrictions were in the form of capital requirements or a certain percentage that you needed to hold. But also in your district, you know, this is a great win for the chemical sector, the machinery sector, and the electric equipment sector as well, where current tariffs in those areas, I think 80% of them will be eliminated immediately upon entry into force. And for your chemicals exporters, they're facing tariffs as high as 50%. So in terms of, you know, on the manufacturing side, there's a huge benefit for your district as well as in the financial services sector.
I appreciate it. I wish there was more manufacturing going on in my district than services at this point, but clearly the services end is very, very important to the city of New York and obviously to the state of New York as well. There's been a great deal of discussion about the lack of movement on trade by the administration, but we really are in the midst of a major trade agenda right now. Would you agree with that?
This is an unbelievably exciting time to be involved in international trade. We've got so much going on, whether it's in the context of these trade agreements, whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whether it's the work we're doing on enforcement, whether it's the work we're doing to address a lot of the problems we have in our relationship with China. There's so much going on that I think everybody at USTR's head's spinning.
So maybe we can dispel some of the rumors that there's kind of a quagmire here. We're not moving out. We're stuck in the mud. We're not moving out of this. That's kind of not really true. Is that correct?
No, that's incorrect. We've got a lot going on in all regions of the world on all issues, from trade expansion to enforcement.
One aspect of trade that I would like to know if you have a comment on is the issue of trade-adjusted assistance and the lack of movement here. Can you make any comment on that?
Yes, I mean, we need to engage in a conversation with Congress about how we're going to move a comprehensive trade agenda forward. You know, that includes the FTAs, but that also includes, as you said, trade adjustment assistance, it includes renewal of our preference programs, and it includes securing PNTR for Russia.
Do you have any observation about why you think TAA has stalled here?
I mean, TAA has been a critical component of our trade policy for years, and we—
I know that, but you won't make any comment as to why you think it may have stalled here.
Well, we're looking forward to getting it renewed as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you, and I'll go back to balance my time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me understand the process. With a trade agreement like this, before the text is sent to Capitol Hill, you engage in technical discussions with the key committees where members of both the majority and minority party go through word for word the agreement, ask questions, and as I understand it, for example, the discussions today from both the majority and minority ask questions, inquire as to how the supplemental agreement, you know, coincides with the original text. That is the normal process, isn't it, before the actual text is sent to the Hill?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about this is a congressional executive partnership, and so we will, you know, sit down together, you know, have drafting sessions on what the implementing bill will look like. I mean, again, we have a draft of that here that we're looking forward to going through with you, you know, which will then lead towards the mock markup that the committee will have. But there are a lot of questions. You know, I think have answers to all of them and are eager to you know get rolling.
Great.
Chairman, you yield for a moment, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
I brought that subject up because the notion that the administration is dragging its heels. I wanted to clarify that the administration is not holding back this agreement, and that the House has not yet asked for it. That's the point I was trying to make. That the House is not, that the President and administration are not dragging their heels on this.
Great, and I agree, and I appreciate too. The House is not either. We simply want a thorough, complete technical discussions and follow, again, the consultation is very important. Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for sharing your expertise and insight with us today. And I guess I would, reflecting on the prior statement, it's quite obvious that the administration is advocating for this trade agreement, so much so that it leaves a lot of us to wonder exactly what the status is, perhaps, of the other two, although there's progress with the Colombia trade agreement. I'm grateful for that. But let me also say that I appreciate USTR. That operation is very impressive in terms of engaging on the issues and responsive, and I'm grateful. But if we could look at this issue, I think we have to, in terms of looking at all three trade agreements and the synergy that can be created as we speak. As you said, this is an exciting time for trade. Let's take advantage of that. And it's not just, although I appreciate your speaking to the advantages for American agriculture and the opportunities associated with this particular trade agreement, as well as the others. But you know, there are other sectors that can benefit as well. Can you speak to the synergy at all, though, about all three trade agreements that we're looking at right now? It's not always that we have an opportunity like this to send, I think, a terrific message geopolitically or geostrategically around the world of how we can engage, and we appreciate our friends in oftentimes hostile regions of the world. Can you speak to that synergy that can exist?
Yeah, I mean, all of these trade agreements are about, you know, two primary things: economic growth and job creation. And you know, I think people think it's trite to say, but it's very true. 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States, and in order for our economy to grow, we've got to export to them. And in order for us to be able to create jobs, we need to take advantage of those export opportunities. And that's what our trade policy is about. It's about fostering economic growth, it's about creating opportunities, and it's about creating jobs.
Thank you. Also, you know, it's interesting, and as I'm sure you're aware, that, and we've heard a little bit earlier this morning, that oftentimes there's kind of a twisting of information out there of what can be accomplished with various trade agreements, and we know that we have a global economy for obvious reasons, and we see U.S. companies perhaps expanding to countries overseas, closer to some of those markets that you just highlighted. Do you see any of that changing? Now, companies are oftentimes criticized for doing so, which is unfortunate because that makes a U.S. company stronger when they can expand closer to various markets worldwide. Can you speak to whether or not that would be changed or viewed any different with respect to expansion?
No, thanks for raising that point. I mean, I think it's important to remember that our investment, U.S. investment in foreign markets, is job creating. 45% of U.S. exports are associated with our firms who are investing overseas. 22 million American jobs depend on U.S. firms who have investments overseas. That's why the investment provisions of our agreements are important, because they level the playing field for our investors, who oftentimes face very difficult challenges in the legal regimes of foreign markets. So through our investment provisions in these agreements, it actually brings our trading partners up to the very high level of investment protection that we provide domestically for ourselves and for foreign investors.
Okay. Also, we've heard a lot about agriculture already. Could you perhaps highlight some of the opportunities in the manufacturing sector, if you could?
Absolutely. As generally speaking broadly, you know, the agreement levels the playing field in the manufacturing sector as it does in the ag sector. Korea's average tariff in the manufacturing sector is around 6.8%. You know, ours is about 2%. Ours is about 3%. So once the agreement goes into force, you know, 95% of Korea's tariffs will be eliminated in the first 5 years of this agreement. And that's going to be a huge boon for our manufacturing sector, including in the area, you know, our chemicals exporters, our machinery exporters. And now that we've been able to do what we did in December, this agreement is now better for our auto exporters, who are going to have new opportunities to sell, you know, our high-quality U.S. cars in Korea's market.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate those numbers that you mentioned, because I think it also points to the fact that when tariffs that our companies face there are higher than what their companies face here, actually we gain more. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm so pleased to see that the strong objections that some of us had on the previous agreement have been adjusted. And I think you're saying in your testimony that there is no outstanding issue now that you know of that could cause a large number of members to be critical of it?
Yes, sir. We worked very hard with you, with Mr. Levin, with Mr. Camp, Mr. Brady, your staffs, to address, you know, one of the key outstanding concerns that was out there in the auto sector. And we are so grateful for the work that we were able to do together to make this better and to allow for us to be sitting here today, you know, together urging for passage of this agreement.
One of the feelings that a lot of Americans have, and is reflected by their representative, is that when you say trade, it means loss of jobs. And I don't think we've done a pretty good job in terms of showing that jobs can and are being created. You made a very generous offer to the gentlelady from the majority that you would share with her the impact in her district. And as Mr. Crawley said, even though we're from New York City, we're concerned with the whole state. For the life of me, I don't know why, especially with the Colombian Agreement, where there are just so many arguments for the jobs that would be created, why none of that is shared with us. Are you familiar at all with the Colombian Agreement and where the manufactured goods that are needed would be coming from? We know the companies' names, and of course, I don't know where they're located, but I've been impressed by the names of the manufacturing companies. Wish they were New York, but nevertheless, if it's the United States, that helps me. Do you go through anything like that in your office?
Yes, sir. We have complete for Korea an analysis on a state-by-state, on a sector-by-sector basis that really goes into great detail. We are in the process of developing those for Colombia and Panama as well, but they're extremely helpful documents. I actually think for Korea purposes today, USTR's website now has a special page on it, on the Korea agreement, that has all of these specific facts, again, on a sector-by-sector and a state-by-state basis.
And the environmental concerns that the government of Korea, we're satisfied that our automobiles are just as safe and environmentally approved as anything that the Koreans produce. Is that right?
Yes, sir. We have very strong, our federal motor vehicle safety standards have the highest safety standards, in the world. Our environmental regulations are the highest standards in the world. And what we've done in terms of safety and environment is we've ensured that Korea's regulations don't place a disproportionate burden on our exporters, while at the same time ensuring the highest level of safety and environmental protection.
Did you answer the question whether or not we can expect the Korean free trade agreement to come by itself, or whether it's going to be included with a whole group of agreements?
That's a conversation we need to have with Congress in terms of how we move forward on the President's comprehensive trade agenda, which includes the pending FTAs, which includes trade adjustment assistance, renewal of our preference programs, as well as securing PNTR for Russia.
Are beef exporters satisfied with the changes in the provision as relates to our exporting of beef?
The Korea agreement addresses the key barrier that our beef exporters have faced, which is the 40% tariff on U.S. beef. Implementation of the agreement will allow our exporters to build on the phenomenal growth in their sales that they've seen over the past few years. Last year, I think exports increased by 140%. We still have concerns with respect to beef, that Korea hasn't fully opened its market to beef from cattle over 30 months. It's something that we're going to continue our work with the Koreans on.
Take my word for it, all the work that you could possibly do in identifying potential jobs in our communities, in our state, and more specifically our congressional district, it works and it's needed. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Chairman Brady. Ambassador, in your testimony you state that the U.S.-Korea trade agreement will result in the removal of tariffs on over 95% of made-in-America industrial and consumer good exports. Specifically, you cite the benefits to the U.S. aerospace industry and its workers. This is especially important to my district in East Hartford, Connecticut, which is the home of a number of aerospace-related companies, including Pratt & Whitney, Hamilton Sundstrand, Kaman, Aerogear, to name just a few. Can you please provide a bit more clarity on how this deal would benefit American aerospace industry and the skilled workers employed in these companies? And further, can you discuss how a delay in enacting the deal would impact these aerospace companies? I ask because the EU's agreement with Korea will be going into place shortly, and many of the world's top aerospace companies are headquartered in Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I had the pleasure of visiting Pratt & Whitney with your staff about 6 months ago, and so thank you for that opportunity. Aerospace is a great example. 92% of our aerospace exports will go duty-free upon implementation of the agreement. The remaining 8% will phase out in 3 years. This is very important, as you mentioned, for EU purposes as well. The EU has a very competitive aerospace industry with ours. If their agreement goes into effect in July, as it is, and ours doesn't go into effect for a long time thereafter, we are going to lose a competitive advantage. And EU exporters of aerospace and other products will have a competitive advantage over ours and will get a foothold in Korea's market. That is why it's critically important that we move this agreement to conclusion as quickly as possible to make sure that exporters of aerospace and all other products are able to really get that competitive leg up in Korea's market before too much time passes.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And I would like to just commend you and Ambassador Kirk, the entire USTR team, as well as the Obama administration, for slowing the process down a little bit with these important trade agreements and seeing if we can get a better deal. And from my perspective, the additional work that went into some of the shall we say, loose ends in regards to Korea. There was significant progress to where it was and where we are today. The same thing is occurring with Colombia and Panama as well. And I think that was exactly what was necessary in order to make, as you described, good agreements even better. And that's how I view this. But we also need to be clear that trade right now in a time of tough economic times, an economy that's underperforming here in the United States, it's a tough sell. I just met with numerous labor leaders back in Wisconsin last week who are adamantly opposed to the Korea trade agreement under the impression that it doesn't go far enough when it comes to labor standards, environmental standards, those type of things, and they're afraid this might result in a race to the bottom. If you had an opportunity to address them, what can you point to specifically in regards to the Korea trade agreement as it relates to labor and environment to try to dispel them of this notion that it's not as tight or not as good as we could hope to see?
Thank you. This agreement provides the highest level of labor and environmental protection that we've had in the history of trade agreements, as does Colombia and Panama as well. This agreement requires both parties to adopt and maintain laws that are consistent with the 5 core ILO labor standards. It requires the parties to effectively enforce those laws, as well as laws that relate to acceptable conditions of work like minimum wage. It requires parties not to waive or derogate from the provisions to achieve a trade or investment advantage, and the standards on the environmental side are equally as high. We're very proud of what we've done on labor and environment in these provisions, and working specifically with a partner like Korea, who with an advanced economy, an advanced labor relations regime, a GDP per capita of $20,000, we've got a good partner on this, and we are looking forward to putting these provisions into place because they provide us, when in place, they will provide us with a further mechanism to address any labor or environmental related concerns that should arise.
And I know your office has been responsive to our request too as far as more detailed information in this regards, and we're trying to do our own economic analysis as far as the impact in Wisconsin. Still a large manufacturing state. We've got many large manufacturers in my congressional district, from 3M to Train Company to Hutchinson, Cummins, who all view this as a real net positive for them and the products that are being produced right in Wisconsin. Also, agriculture production is key to our state. But there's one sector that's really been struggling the last couple of years, and it's dairy production, our dairy farmers. Is there something here in Korea that we can offer the dairy industry of America to us?
Yes, it's a great agreement for dairy in that it reduces tariffs and it expands tariff rate quotas. For instance, upon implementation, our dairy exporters will see duty-free tariff rate quotas for a number of products, cheese, butter, certain milk powders. This is a great agreement for dairy, and again, like for other sectors, the sooner we get it into force, the sooner they will be able to benefit.
And you said there's still hopefully some progress that can be made on beef. Is there something more tangible you can?
Yeah, I mean, on beef, the key thing is as soon as the agreement goes into force, we begin to eliminate the 40% tariff on beef, and that's really important, particularly as Australia is in the process of negotiating an FTA with Korea. We don't want to have our beef exporters put at a competitive disadvantage to Australia. Korea's tariff's high, 40%, and as it lowers for us before Australia, we're going to get a competitive leg up in the market. We do continue to have concerns, though, with lingering restrictions on beef from cattle over 30 months. It's something we're working on, with Korea as well as with our other Asian trading partners, Japan and China as well, and we expect to make progress.
Let me ask you one final question. We're running out of time, but I think that in order to have an honest conversation with the American people, trade is a two-way street. There are going to be benefits flowing the other way. Let me ask you a question that you don't hear from many members of Congress in that when we're looking at these trade agreements, but what's in it for Korea? Why is Korea interested in entering into this trade agreement when we already have pretty low tariffs and pretty easy market access to what they're producing?
We are a very important market for countries around the world. We are the biggest consumer market. What this agreement does for Korea, it really locks in a preferential regime for Korea, so for Korean exporters to be able to benefit from the wide consumer market that we have here. So we like to call it, again, it's a trite expression to say it's a win-win, but it really is. We get significant benefits in Korea, and Korea gets significant benefits being able to access our huge market more competitively than some of its competitors.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ambassador, let me just start by thanking you and Ambassador Kirk and Ambassador Hahn for all of the success in moving this outstanding opportunity forward for job growth, which is really what it is about. It is about jobs and economic growth, but also new sales, new customers, and that's the message we all need to communicate bipartisanly to really see this successfully move forward. And I know the votes are there. It's going to happen, as well as the opportunity for all three trade agreements. Let me just ask you a question really quick, because we focus a lot about manufacturing and the services industry as well. I know that U.S. industries that depend on intellectual property rights employ millions of American workers, and they support very high-paying jobs. And it's absolutely estimated now that there's a broad range of U.S. industries that depend on IP, intellectual property rights. They account for about 60% of U.S. exports and drive nearly 40% of U.S. economic growth. And our trade agreements, including the pending ones now before us, set very high standards for protecting United States intellectual property rights abroad that help support U.S. innovations, U.S. entrepreneurship, U.S. competitiveness, and jobs. Do you agree with this assessment, and could you please give a couple of examples maybe of how these pending trade agreements with South Korea and the other agreements protect our intellectual property rights to the benefit of U.S. workers and the U.S. economy?
Thanks for raising that. I mean, IP is a critical chapter of this agreement, as it is with Panama and Colombia, and we have some pretty incredible IP protections in this across industry, in the area of copyrights, trademark, patents as well. It's, the agreement strengthened deterrence against criminal acts of commercial scale piracy. It really beefs up our ability to enforce provisions against piracy, against counterfeiting. It goes much farther in the area of combating internet piracy as well. In the area of trademarks, these agreements have state-of-the-art provisions that recognize sound marks and scent marks, and also have again very strong deterrent and enforcement provisions. It extends the term of protection for certain copyrighted works consistent with U.S. law and emerging international standards. I mean, I can go on and on. It streamlines and strengthens customs procedures to increase the efficiency of border enforcement to deter counterfeit products at our border. So these the intellectual property provisions in the Korea agreement in particular, which I know best, but also in Colombia and Panama, are really state-of-the-art.
Well, thank you. And I just raise that because that's an issue I often hear from my small manufacturing and medium manufacturing companies back home, not to mention others that really are concerned about protecting our innovative ideas here in the United States. And so this is something that sort of gets glossed over, and it's an opportunity to really enhance and protect that. So I just want to thank you for that. And we heard a lot of examples here from the members on the committee of how our own individual districts or states will benefit under this agreement, and I just know that that's going to be the continued case, Mr. Chairman, as you work with the administration and bringing the other agreements forward as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to reclaim just a moment of my time to clarify something. If I understand correctly, we have the Korean FTA draft implementing legislation here. I just want to make it clear the Democrats want you to send it up here today. It's time to move the ball and get the FTA moving. Let's not play this game about who asked whom, and we're going to play back and forth. If you got it, send it. Let's move it.
The excitement is mounting, Ambassador. Thank you for being here. I want to thank you for your testimony, and thank the members for their thoughtful questions on both sides of the aisle. And let me note as well, Ambassador knows this, the members may submit questions for the record. If they do, I hope you'll respond promptly. And again, thank you for the insight today and your time. I'd like to welcome our second panel to step forward today. We are joined by 4 witnesses. Our first witness will be Mr. Bill Rhodes, Chairman of the U.S.-Korea Business Council. He's also Chairman and CEO of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors and Senior Advisor to Citigroup. He is testifying on behalf of the U.S.-Korea Business Council and the U.S.-Korea FTA Business Coalition. After him, we will hear from Dr. John Schock, President and CEO of Profile Products, LLP, who's also testifying on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Our third witness will be Mr. Robert Holliman, President and CEO of the Business Software Alliance. And last, we will hear from Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, who served as the U.S. Ambassador to South Korea from 2001 through 2004, and now is Senior Director for Asia at McClarty Associates. We welcome all of you, and we look forward to your testimony. I would also ask that our witnesses keep their testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Rhodes, your written statement, like those of all the witnesses, will be made part of the record, and you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, Ranking Member McDermott, members of the subcommittee, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you and testify on the KORUS FTA, which I will refer to as KORUS going forward. I serve as the chairman of the U.S.-Korea Business Council, which is an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and is a leading business organization promoting the bilateral U.S.-Korea commercial relationship. The Council is secretariat for the U.S.-Korea FTA Business Coalition, which represents nearly 1,000 companies, businesses, and agricultural organizations and chambers of commerce that support the approval of the pending trade agreement with Korea. I am also senior advisor to Citigroup and president of CEO of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors. I am chairman emeritus of the Council of the Americas, the Americas Society, and a professor at large at Brown University. In wearing all these hats, I am a vigorous proponent of trade liberalization and, in fact, was one of those early on who urged the U.S. and Korean governments to launch the negotiation of a free trade agreement. Approval and implementation of the agreement with Korea, along with agreements with Colombia and Panama, are among the most important actions that the U.S. Congress can take to achieve President Obama's goal of doubling U.S. exports in 5 years and creating new jobs and economic opportunities in communities across the country, and in building an infrastructure that promotes regional prosperity and stability. On that note, I want to applaud the action of the Obama and Santos administrations for having reached agreement on the Labor Action Plan, which will also allow the Colombia FTA to move forward and be considered by Congress. We have also seen important progress which has been made on Panama, so that agreement can also be moved forward in the future. All of these agreements are important for American growth and job creation. But given the specific hearing today, I want to talk about the U.S. business community and how it sees the Korea Agreement specifically, and especially the benefits to U.S. economic and geostrategic goals. This groundbreaking agreement will bring significant benefits to American workers, business, farmers, consumers, and the U.S. economy. The scale and breadth of U.S. trade with South Korea, $1 trillion economy with 49 million consumers, that is already the 7th largest U.S. export market and trading partner. This makes KORUS the most commercially significant bilateral U.S. trade agreement in nearly 2 decades. I believe we are close to the finish line on KORUS, but I think we can all agree it's been a long and winding course. We recognize that concerns raised by U.S. stakeholders with respect to certain measures in KORUS needed to be addressed in order for the agreement to move forward. We applaud the tireless efforts of the White House and Blue House, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, and I must say Ambassadors Kirk, Morantis, and Wendy Cutler have done a first-rate job here, and members of Congress and the Korean trade negotiator counterparts for identifying the solutions that we have finally come to. The new provisions reached in December added powerful new momentum for moving the KORUS agreement forward. KORUS is a centerpiece of America's international economic engagement. The United States International Trade Commission, USITC, estimated in September 2007 that the agreement could increase U.S. exports by 10 to 11 billion annually. President Obama has said on many occasions that it would add 70,000 U.S. jobs when this agreement is approved. An updated statement of potential economic effects of the agreement prepared in January of this year, January 2011, by the U.S. ITC economic staff at the request of the Senate Finance Committee Trade Subcommittee, estimated that the agreement could generate as many as 280,000 jobs. Moreover, Korean companies are expanding their investment in the United States and have created thousands of American jobs in manufacturing, as well as distribution and supplier networks across our country. By reaffirming the openness of the U.S. market and attractiveness of the United States as a destination for investment, and by lowering barriers to U.S. exports in the Korean market, Korea has the potential to accelerate all these job-creating opportunities that I've mentioned. But the agreement cannot solely be quantified in terms of bilateral economic impact. KORUS also has significant implications for the U.S. national economic security and geostrategic priorities, both in Asia-Pacific and globally.
Mr. Rhodes, if I may, we're going to adhere to the 5-minute limit on initial statements. I do have questions I would like to ask you when we conclude. And just for the panel's information, we have been called to votes. I would like to work through Mr. Schock's testimony, break for the 3 votes, and then we'll reconvene immediately after the last vote is taken. So Mr. Schock, Mr. Rhodes, thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Schock, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, Ranking Member McDermott, and distinguished members of the Ways and Means Committee on Trade. My name is John Schock, and I am President and CEO of Profile Products, LLC, headquartered in Buffalo Grove, Illinois. I'm testifying today on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the world's largest business federation, representing the interests of more than 3 million businesses of all size, sectors, regions, as well as state and local chambers and industry associations. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk about the important benefits of passing the pending free trade agreements for American jobs and U.S. economic growth, and specifically how the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, known as KORUS, will boost Profile's exports and generate greater employment opportunities for our company's manufacturing facilities around the country. For over 50 years, Profile Products has been a leading producer of the market's broadest line of erosion and sediment control products, turf establishment products, and complementary accessories to control erosion and accelerate seed germination. We also manufacture the industry's best-selling inorganic soil amendments for sports field, golf course, and landscape applications. With approximately 200 employees in 4 manufacturing facilities, 2 sales offices, and personnel domiciled around the country, Profile is able to manufacture and market its entire line of products from the United States. Profile manufactures its products in 4 rural towns throughout the country: Blue Mountain, Mississippi, Conover, North Carolina, Limestone, Tennessee, and Sanger, California. These communities understand that the number of people that we employ is directly related to the volume of orders our company receives. So as our exports grow, so will the hours of production and the number of employee shifts we need to operate in order to complete those orders. Today, I am proud to say that our products are represented in more than 50 countries around the world. While many Americans believe that trade only benefits large multinational corporations, the reality is more than 97% of U.S. exporters are small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs. In 2008, almost 21,000 U.S. companies exported $34.8 billion worth of merchandise to Korea alone. Of the total exporters, 18,500, or over 89%, were SMEs. Profile is one of the many U.S. SMEs that benefited from exporting to Korea's dynamic market. In fact, Korea is our single largest export market, making up 12% of our total international sales revenue. Since 2009, Profile has sold more than 2,000 tons of our products into Korea. Several golf courses in Korea, including the prestigious Jack Nicklaus Signature Golf Club, feature Profile's products. As global demand for Profile's innovative solutions has increased, so too has the effect of global sales on our company's workforce. In 2010, 13 to 14% of our sales came from overseas orders. We anticipate that number to grow to 15 to 17% of our total sales in 2011. If you do the calculation, that means approximately 28 of our 200 employees are employed as a direct result of the company's exports. While our company has achieved considerable success in Korea and other markets, one of the greatest challenges we face is the complex array of foreign barriers to American exports. These include both tariff and non-tariff barriers. Free trade agreements like the pending trade deal with Korea will remove these barriers and create new opportunities and economic benefits for U.S. businesses through tariff elimination, greater market access, more efficient customs regimes, stronger intellectual property protections, and other market opening provisions. For Profile, this would mean being able to sell our products to Korea at a significantly lower landed price. Tariffs on our products currently range from 3 to 8%. With passage of KORUS, those tariffs would be eliminated immediately. In addition, Korea has been a particularly challenging market for Profile in terms of trademark and patent infringement. KORUS will provide protections for intellectual property similar to those in the U.S. So in conclusion, in support of the job-creating, market-opening deal with Korea and our other trading partners, I respectfully urge Congress to boost exports and generate jobs through swift approval of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement and the pending trade deals with Colombia and Panama. The time for action is now. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Schock. Mr. Holloman, Ambassador, if you'll hang tight for these votes, I apologize. We'll be back as soon as it's over. And the committee's recessed till then. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, what I finished was 6 seconds.
Subcommittee on Trade will reconvene. Thank you again for your patience, all of you. Mr. Holloman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McDermott, thank you for holding this hearing today and inviting the Business Software Alliance to testify. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to express BSA's strong support for speedy approval of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Reducing software theft and ensuring fair and open access to overseas markets are essential to the software industry. We support the KORUS FTA because it advances both of these goals. Korea has already demonstrated the capacity and the will to reduce software piracy through sustained high levels of enforcement. We expect that once KORUS is implemented fully, these efforts will continue and improve as long as Korea's implementation of one element of KORUS, which I will discuss in a moment, does not disrupt our efforts for current effective anti-piracy efforts. Mr. Chairman and members of this subcommittee, the U.S. is just emerging from a deep economic crisis. Our country's ability to export and create jobs is going to be a key factor in our growth. The software industry in the U.S. already enjoys a $39 billion trade surplus with the rest of the world. And that's not surprising when you consider that 60 cents of every dollar spent on software around the world comes back to U.S.-based software companies. Our industry is well positioned to contribute even more to the positive side of our trade balance for this country. The biggest barrier we face today in markets is end-user piracy, when otherwise legal businesses use software as a tool of production but do not pay for it. It is vitally important to have strong copyright and enforcement provisions in all FTAs, and a number of provisions in KORUS help protect the intellectual property of U.S. businesses operating in Korea. They include requiring that government agencies use only legal software, protection for temporary reproductions, protection against circumvention of technological measures, and the exclusive right to make works available online. The KORUS FTA also includes numerous obligations that provide for strong enforcement of intellectual property rights, including statutory damages and service provider liability. Each of these elements is also included in the pending agreements with Panama and Colombia, which is why we support those agreements as well. Korea is a story of progress. Let me take a moment to share a little of that story. The BSA and I have been fighting software piracy and software theft in Korea for 20 years. About 10 years ago, Korea made an explicit commitment to the U.S. that it would conduct a high volume of actions against businesses who use illegal software on a sustained basis. Korea's efforts as a result of that commitment to the U.S. have driven the piracy rate down by nearly 10 points over the past decade, while software sales have increased by more than 40%. A key factor of this progress has been the element of Korean law that permits right holders to bring criminal complaints against end-user piracy and withdraw those complaints when there is an agreement reached with the offending party. And that element may be repealed as part of FTA implementation in Korea. Software piracy remains a substantial problem in Korea, with rates double those here in the U.S. The KORUS FTA must build on the successful efforts taking place today under existing law and expand upon those in ways that will continue to bring software theft down. Most importantly, Korea must commit to maintain a vigorous and undiminished criminal enforcement efforts against business end-user piracy. We urge this committee to help ensure that happens. In conclusion, the KORUS FTA is an important agreement with a major trading partner. It includes world-class IPR protections and ensures open markets for IT services and e-commerce. We urge Congress to approve the KORUS FTA and also to play a role in its successful implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holloman. Ambassador Hubbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is indeed an honor for me to be here today, and I appreciate your inviting me here. As a career Foreign Service officer for nearly 40 years, I spent a lot of time in the various Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committee. This is the first time I've testified to the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm honored to be in the big time.
Well, we're honored to have you here. Welcome.
My colleagues here today have made very clear that the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement is a critical step forward for American job creation and ensuring U.S. economic competitiveness in Asia. I'd like to stress that this trade agreement is also an important investment in the overall U.S.-South Korea alliance at a time when heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula require our solidarity with our allies in the South. And it will also be a strong manifestation of the U.S. commitment to remain a major presence in Asia. 60 years ago, the U.S. stood with the Republic of Korea in countering aggression from the Communist North. That bloody conflict, which cost the lives of more than 35,000 Americans, has yet to result in a permanent peace. North Korea continues to challenge the world through its nuclear weapons programs, and its recent attacks on the South have reminded us of the military threat and raised deep concerns throughout Northeast Asia. The Korean Peninsula remains a very dangerous place. However, there has been a spectacular success story amidst ongoing tensions. South Korea has risen to be the world's 14th largest economy, a vibrant democracy, and a valued ally for the United States in a critical region. Moving ahead with KORUS will also be a concrete demonstration that the United States is prepared more broadly to lead on trade in Asia. This is a signal that all of our partners in the region want to see. The economies of Asia are in the process of integration and are now trading more with each other than they are with the United States. Bilateral and regional free trade agreements are proliferating, and the ROK is in the vanguard. We cannot afford to wait on the sidelines while the region pursues agreements that leave us out. KORUS will give us special access to the Korean market, enhancing our ability to compete with China, Japan, and India, and Europe, even as it strengthens Korea's ties to the United States. And I think KORUS may also provoke wider liberalization. Approval of KORUS will lend impetus, among other things, to the effort to develop the Trans-Pacific Partnership and move beyond that to a free trade zone of the Asia-Pacific. But the economic benefits are just part of the equation. Strategic interests are also overwhelming at a time when the U.S. is dealing with a host of new security threats, including North Korea's nuclear weapons program. This free trade agreement will strengthen our strategic partnership with an important Asian ally that shares our belief in democracy and has stepped up to the plate with military contributions in various places in the world. One of South Korea's primary goals in seeking the free trade agreement with the United States is to broaden and strengthen its relationship with its ally at a time when rapid changes in East Asia, including China's rapid rise, has provoked significant changes in power relationships in Asia. We strongly share the Republic of Korea's interest in solidifying and broadening this critical alliance. And a failure to approve KORUS would be exactly the wrong signal to North Korea and to our allies and friends in Asia who want us to remain strongly engaged. As Chairman Rangel knows as well as any of us, Americans and South Koreans shared blood together to prevent a communist takeover of the entire peninsula 60 years ago. We still stand together in facing the many challenges from the North. The FTA with Korea will strengthen America's relationship with our longtime ally and enhance our presence and influence in a very critical region. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much. Appreciate the testimony. Mr. Schock, you're a real-life example of how a small business can compete and win in these growing markets, and how removing those barriers can help make those sales at a time when every sale counts.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Holloman, you laid out both the progress that's been made, but also how that's expanded in this agreement with intellectual property protections key to millions of jobs in one of our most dynamic industries growing in America. Thank you for that testimony. I wanted to ask Mr. Rhodes and Ambassador Hubbard to both those testimonies build up to the bigger picture on this trade agreement. I'd like Mr. Rhodes and Mr. Hubbard to sort of expand on the geostrategic benefits of this. Clearly, South Korea is a critical ally. This strengthens the agreement, strengthens that relationship, but it also strengthens America as a counterweight to China in that region, both in trade and other areas. Clearly, Asia-Pacific region is blowing and going. They are moving ahead, whether we are engaged or not. They would like us there as a counterweight to China in many areas, but frankly, they're not waiting for us to engage. They're moving ahead without us. So I'd like, if Mr. Rhodes, Ambassador Hubbard, expand upon those benefits, how critical it is that this not fail as an agreement, more critically, what the benefits are for us as we move ahead. Mr. Rhodes.
Thank you, Chairman Brady. I think it is critical. I think that given the situation in North Korea, as we've seen by the Cheonan and the shelling of the island over the last months, and the problem of the nuclear situation there, it's critical for that. Also, I think you pointed out very correctly, China is watching this agreement very, very carefully. And so I think as a demonstration in that area, I think our allies all over Asia are watching this. And as you know, there was a thought at one time of putting a Northeast Asian economic group together of Japan, China, and Korea, which would have left the U.S. out. And so I think it's very important, along with this EU agreement that's coming on board, that we stand up with Korea and all the benefits that we've all talked about on U.S. exports to Korea. So it's a win-win on both strategic as well as economic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Ambassador?
Well, Mr. Chairman, several people today have mentioned that the United States in 2003 was South Korea's leading trading partner in the world. Now it's number 4th with China in the lead. If you go around the East Asia region, you will find that China has moved into first place almost everywhere where you look. And they're uncomfortable with that. The other countries of Asia are looking to this agreement as an indication of whether the United States is committed to the region, whether we're committed to lead on trade liberalization in the region. And they're all hopeful that we will approve KORUS as quickly as possible as a sign of our continued commitment there.
Right. Great point. Thank you, Ambassador. Ranking Member McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Holliman, I don't have any real questions because we all agree on let's move this thing. But I do, since I've got you sitting here, I got a question. I know that you're interested in Korea today, but I'm going to ask you a question about China. At the end of last year, as part of the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, China's commitments to a number of things to address software piracy in China. Just before that meeting, almost every member of the Ways and Means, including all the current subcommittee members on the Democratic side, wrote a letter expressing the need to measure progress, quote, measure progress on greater U.S. market access into China and protection of U.S. intellectual property rights by objective criteria, close quote, such as increased exports to and sales in China. And almost 4 months have passed since then. Is there any measurable criteria or any statistics you can give us that will help us understand if this had any impact whatsoever?
Thank you, Mr. McDermott, for that question. Unfortunately, as of today, there is nothing that I can say in terms of measurements of increased sales. from my members that I have learned that would tell me that there has been any market improvement on the status as it existed when this committee, members of the committee sent that letter. And I want to thank you for doing that, because that was enormously important. I know that the White House has made this an important issue. Your colleagues at the Senate have, but we haven't seen the kind of measurable progress that was certainly expected, I know, by members of this committee, and that was hoped for by our industry.
Is there anything at all hopeful you can say about the relationship with respect to China in this area?
Well, I think the hopeful thing I can say is that the nature of the commitments, if fulfilled, should result in the kind of increased sales. So this is a case where we don't need additional commitments. In fact, the commitments around business software are quite specific. What we need is full implementation. I'll also mention one thing in contrast with Korea, where Korea has undertaken 40 to 50 criminal cases a month on a sustained basis against businesses using illegal software, and that's helped bring the piracy rate down, and we want it to continue to do that. By contrast, there has never been a criminal action in China against a commercial enterprise using pirated software. China would indicate that that's not permitted under the law, and so it's not surprised that the piracy rates in China, in terms of percentage market, are double what they are in Korea. And of course, the value keeps rising as the Chinese market grows. So I think that the continued interest and pressure from this committee and from the administration, I know President Obama has personally engaged on this, but to show concrete results from China, not just commitments, will be critical.
I think it's important for people to understand the Koreans keep their promise and work at it and bring cases. And unfortunately, that's not happening in China. I try to understand what their thinking is. Can you explain? Are they do they do it just more slowly and someday they'll do it? Or is it simply they make a commitment and then throw it in the wastebasket and walk out of the room?
You know, I mean, we have certainly seen some efforts around creating budgets for purchase of legal software by the government, some administrative enforcement, but there's nothing that is of sufficient magnitude to provide a deterrence in the marketplace against businesses using illegal software, or indeed for the government to use only legal software. By contrast, Korea, which used to have periodic campaigns, 2 or 3 months of a crackdown, and then they would stop, about 10 years ago committed to the U.S. government that they would do 40 to 50 software enterprise cases a month, and that was sustained. And that has been the key to bringing piracy down in Korea, what we think is key going forward to future progress. And we see periodic minor campaigns in China, but nothing on a sustained basis. And so Korea, I think, really is the model for what China should be doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Hubbard, CORUS has been strongly endorsed by many experts as a means of enhancing our economic and national security relationships between the two countries. President Obama has referred to our relationship with Korea as the linchpin of security and Asian policy. Considering the United States maintains over 28,000 troops on the peninsula right now, Ambassador, I was wondering if you could discuss from your personal perspective and experience how the passage of CORUS will strengthen our relationship with this key ally, and how trade agreements more broadly, like Colombia and Panama, will have significant geostrategic impact as well.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Basically, this agreement, this trade agreement, in my view, will both broaden and strengthen the alliance that we've had for the last 60 years. You know, military arrangements, military alliances don't stand alone, even when you face a threat as palpable as the North Korean threat is to South Korea. They need to be given content, through people-to-people ties, and we do have wonderful people-to-people ties with Korea. They need to be given content through trade relations. They need to be given content through special relationships of all kinds. For example, one of the things that was very, very important to Korea in recent years was to get on the visa waiver program as a kind of a symbol of their relationship. Koreans, like other countries, need constant assurances that we are with them, that we understand their issues, their problems, we value the relationship. And at this stage, passage of this FTA, I think, is the best way we can give those assurances. And this is really a time when we need it after the attacks on South Korea and the other issues that are concerning them.
Would you say that when the United States delays on passing agreements after they've been largely negotiated, that can have an adverse effect on our long-term national security and geostrategic goals in a region of the world?
Yes, indeed. I think the Koreans have been disappointed in the delays in passing this agreement. Korea is a democracy, a functioning democracy, and I think they understand democracy in our country and why it has been delayed. But over time, a failure to fulfill governmental commitments of this kind does have a negative impact on the broader relationship, and we should get moving on this.
Would you agree that that same principle applies with the Colombia Agreement as well?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you. I
Very
yield back.
strongly support that.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Chairman Rangle.
I don't want to beat a dead horse, but no one works more closely than the Koreans than I do, and I am certain that they would rather have an agreement where they have the votes for it, no matter how long it did take, rather than not to have it. Having said that, I think we all agree that it's good for our country, it's good for Korea. There's all types of economic, political, national security reasons why we should support this agreement, especially after certain provisions were improved so that we can get the votes that are necessary in order to get it passed. Having said all that, I think all of you would agree with me that the major obstacle that we have in the country and in the Congress is the belief that this agreement, as all trade agreement, would lose jobs. And of course, most of us believe that the evidence would support otherwise. But it's difficult to explain to people without showing them what it means to our country, our region, our industries, and of course, our congressional districts. So if I could just say, if someone challenged you, Dr. Rhodes, and we go down the line and said that they knew specifically that we would lose jobs here, besides saying they're wrong, are you able to tell where these jobs will be located to any degree that the person walking away say, well, I'll check that tomorrow and I'll get back to you?
I think, and you and I have discussed this before, I think at the Chamber we have been very specific on making trips throughout the United States to various areas, pointing out where job growth will take place. And I think that we could do a better job. You can always do a better job, but I think we've made a real effort to do so. And I was just in Dallas last night giving a talk to a group, and the question came up exactly on that. And so I think we do have facts and figures in areas where these jobs are being created. And so I think our job is to get out there and sell it even more, as you and I have discussed in the past.
But you would not be able to tell, say, a guy from New York exactly where to go for so that I can go to the recipients of this agreement and tell them, look for an increase in jobs in this area.
We will give you a list. Yes, we do. I will give you a list. We'll make sure you get a list today.
That is great. Is there anyone that can give a little more specifics, or generally would you accept what Dr. Rhodes has said as the general answer?
I agree with Mr. Rhodes, and we'll help him put that together.
You know, I have been impressed with the number of jobs that are going to be made available under the Colombian Free Trade Agreement. And just to test the knowledge of the members of Congress, I asked them, do you really believe that Caterpillar and other earth-moving machinery will be one of our greatest exports? They said there's no question about it. It's a mining country, there's growth there, and they really want to buy from us. Then I asked the next question, do you know where Caterpillars are made? Nobody knows. It just seems to me that there's a big gap, because if they were made in my district, you would have heard from me loud and clear. Give us a break, give us jobs, let's expand. And yet, I don't remember anyone ever going to the floor saying, with the exception of those from Michigan with the Korean Agreement, which took a little time to reach, but we did. But I don't remember people saying, I don't like trade generally, but this agreement is going to help my people in my district. And if you have any of those clippings around your office, you can send those in to me as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairman, very much. Mr. Reichert, to close this out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to touch on some of Mr. Rangel's comments. I totally agree with the gentleman and his observation that there really needs to be a concerted effort regarding education about the number of jobs that are created through these agreements. And again, as I said earlier during the first panel discussion, this is all about selling American products. And so we should all in America be about selling American. And as was also stated earlier, 95% of our market is outside our borders. So we should really work hard. And again, this Export Council is looking at ways that we might be able to help in really beating the drum on the number of jobs that are created by these trade agreements, and of course the other obvious benefits. I'd like to touch on with Ambassador. First of all, thank you for your years of service to our country, and happy to have you here today. I'm interested in your views on the importance of approving the Korean Agreement in solidifying Americans' presence in the Asia-Pacific region, and Mr. Davis touched on it just a little bit as far as security goes, but how does finally coming to agreement with Korea impact our ability to negotiate further trade agreements with other countries around the world?
First and foremost, Mr. Reichert, it establishes a very good precedent and standard. This is a very high-quality agreement. Frankly, it's of higher quality than most of the agreements that have been reached within Asia and within the Asia-Pacific. And so this will be a standard that all other agreements can be
Would it
measured.
also, would this affect our ability in the TPP efforts also?
Yes, very much so. I think this, I think it relates to TPP in a couple of ways. One, our partners in the TPP are looking at Chorus as a signal of whether the United States can be counted on to do the sensible thing in its own interest, and that will have its impact. Secondly, it will help improve the standards of the TPP. And I think eventually, based on Chorus, that Korea will probably also want to join TPP at a later time, as might Japan.
Sure.
And that will all strengthen our posture in Asia.
So there is a bright light shining on us right now as to our success, right?
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
Exactly.
What about intellectual property rights in the region? How do you think the Korean Agreement might affect those as we look at, of course, everyone mentions China. It's the most obvious offender.
Well, Mr. Holliman obviously knows more about that than I do, but again, it sets a very good standard. Korea's enforcement sets a good standard. And I think other countries are going to bear that in mind as we move forward.
Mr. Holliman, would you like to respond to that, please?
Certainly, the Chorus really provides the strongest levels of protection of intellectual property of any U.S. free trade agreements. Those are mirrored in substantial part in Colombia and Panama. And we think that that is really, in locking those in place, will ensure not only tools against fighting piracy, but as new e-commerce and services come on board, like software as a service and cloud computing, it will ensure that that next wave of computing technology has unfettered access to the Korean market. So it's critical. What we need on the IP side is to ensure that existing practices of high volume, sustained criminal actions against enterprise end users of pirated software will be maintained in Korea going forward, and that existing procedures that allow rights holders to successfully resolve actions against those corporations when they become legal customers can be maintained, and that's a key element in implementation where we urge this committee's continued attention.
Great, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Riker. I want to thank the members for their thoughtful questions, and let me note for our witnesses how much we appreciate your testimony. Members may submit questions for the record, and if they do, I hope you'll respond promptly. I know you will. And our witnesses today, who come from all parts of industry and job creation, as well as our geopolitical role, made clear the pending trade agreement with South Korea, as well as with the pending agreements with Colombia and Panama, offers significant benefits. Not moving forward will only harm American interests and the ability of American workers, businesses, and farmers to compete in these markets as our competitors move ahead. As I said earlier, I'm excited about moving forward on the South Korea agreement, and just as I'm excited to move forward with Panama, Colombia, I hope we'll continue the constructive bipartisan technical work on the Korean agreement and begin the work on the Latin agreements to ensure that these draft implementing bills are complete and thorough and ready to move forward in a timely manner. Strongly believe we should consider all three agreements by July 1st and hope we'll continue to work together to make that happen. But for now, the committee is adjourned.